At 1800 hours on April 25, 1945, a German demolition crew detonated depth charges aboard the aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin in the Parnitz River near Stettin. The explosions ripped through her hull. Water flooded compartments that had never been sealed. Machinery that had never run seized and twisted. Aircraft that would never fly remained crated in storage facilities ashore. The ship that was supposed to give Germany naval air power settled into shallow water, scuttled by her own caretakers as Soviet forces advanced from the east. She was 95% complete. She had never sailed under her own power. She had never launched a single aircraft. 8 years of construction. 3 starts, 3 stops, 56 million Reichsmarks spent. And at the end, nothing but a half-finished hull deliberately destroyed to prevent capture. This was not the story of a ship sunk in battle. This was the story of institutional failure, of bureaucratic warfare more destructive than any naval engagement, of 2 powerful men whose rivalry ensured that Germany would never possess the naval air power it desperately needed. The story begins in 1935, when Adolf Hitler announced that Germany would build aircraft carriers. The announcement was strategic theater, a declaration that Germany would compete with Britain, America, and Japan as a naval power. The Treaty of Versailles had prohibited German carrier construction. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of June 1935 gave Germany the legal framework to build approximately 40,000 tons of carrier displacement. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, immediately began planning. Raeder was 59 years old, a career naval officer who had joined the Imperial German Navy in 1894 at age 18. He had served through World War I, commanded cruisers, risen through staff positions, survived the naval mutinies of 1918, and rebuilt what remained of German naval forces through the Weimar years. He understood naval power. He understood that Britain's dominance rested on carrier aviation. He understood that Germany's only chance of challenging British sea control required carriers. But he also understood he had a problem. Hermann Göring controlled everything that flew in Germany. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was 42 years old in 1935. He had been a fighter ace in World War I, credited with 22 victories, commanded the Jagdgeschwader I after Manfred von Richthofen's death. He had joined the Nazi Party early, participated in the failed Beer Hall Putsch, risen to become Hitler's designated successor. He was Reich Minister of Aviation. He was Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, and he had absolutely no intention of allowing the Kriegsmarine to control any aircraft, regardless of whether those aircraft operated from ships or from land bases. The rivalry between Raeder and Göring was personal, political, and institutional. Raeder represented the traditional officer class, aristocratic, professional, focused on military effectiveness. Göring represented the new Nazi elite, opportunistic, political, focused on personal power and institutional aggrandizement. Raeder wanted a German navy capable of challenging Britain. Göring wanted total control of all German air assets and viewed the navy as a competitor for resources, prestige, and Hitler's attention. In 1935, as Hitler authorized carrier construction, Göring made one concession. A special branch of the Luftwaffe for naval operations would be created in cooperation with the Kriegsmarine. Naval officers would be transferred to the Luftwaffe to form this branch. In wartime, the Navy would control and operate this branch. Raeder accepted the compromise. It was inadequate but better than nothing. At least carrier aircraft would exist, even if their institutional ownership remained contested. On November 16, 1935, the contract for Flugzeugträger A was awarded to Deutsche Werke Shipyard in Kiel. The designation meant Aircraft Carrier A. The Kriegsmarine did not name ships before launch. If completed, she would be christened later. A second carrier, Flugzeugträger B, would follow under Plan Z, Raeder's ambitious expansion program. Germany would have 4 carriers by 1945. The design work proceeded under difficult constraints. Germany had no experience building aircraft carriers. The Treaty of Versailles had prevented carrier construction for 15 years. The last German naval aviation assets had been disbanded in 1918. The institutional memory was gone. The engineering expertise didn't exist. Everything had to be learned from scratch or acquired from foreign sources. In autumn 1935, a delegation consisting of a Luftwaffe officer, a naval officer, and a constructor visited Japan. they obtained flight deck equipment blueprints. They inspected the aircraft carrier Akagi. The Japanese were cooperative, sharing technical information about catapults, arresting gear, hangar design, aircraft elevators. The Germans also attempted to examine the British carrier HMS Furious, but were refused access. The Japanese information became the foundation for Graf Zeppelin's design. The ship that emerged reflected German naval architecture philosophy applied to an unfamiliar platform. She measured 262.5 meters overall length, beam 36.2 meters at flight deck, 24.6 meters at waterline. Standard displacement, 23,200 tons. Full load displacement, 33,550 tons. This was large for 1936 design, comparable to American Yorktown-class carriers or Japanese Shokaku-class. 4 sets of brown Bovary geared steam turbines drove 4 shafts. 16 Lamont high-pressure boilers generated 200,000 shaft horsepower. Design speed, 33.8 knots. Range 8,000 nautical miles at 19 knots. Endurance, 40 days without refueling. These were excellent propulsion specifications, reflecting German engineering strengths in turbine design and high-pressure steam systems. The armament revealed the fundamental conceptual problem. Graf Zeppelin was designed as a hybrid warship, combining carrier aviation with heavy surface armament. 16 SKC/28 150mm guns in 8 twin turrets, 4 per side, mounted in the hull between the hangar deck and flight deck. 12 SKC/33 105mm anti-aircraft guns in 6 twin mounts, 22 SKC/30 37mm guns, 28 20mm flak guns. This was heavy armament for an aircraft carrier, heavier than American or British carriers, comparable only to early Japanese designs that also emphasized surface combat capability. The design philosophy was commerce rating. Graf Zeppelin would accompany battleships and cruisers on sorties into the Atlantic, providing air cover while also engaging enemy surface forces with her own guns. The 150mm weapons could destroy destroyers and damage light cruisers. The anti-aircraft battery would defend against air attack. The aircraft would conduct reconnaissance, attack enemy shipping, and defend the task force. The ship was designed to fight. This was wrong. The Americans, British, and Japanese had learned through 2 decades of carrier operations that aircraft were the weapon. The ship was merely the platform. Wasting displacement on heavy guns reduced aircraft capacity, complicated damage control, and created vulnerabilities. But Germany had no operational experience to inform design decisions. The hybrid concept seemed logical to planners who understood battleships but not carriers. Protection reflected similar thinking. The flight deck was armored with 40 to 60 millimeters of Wotan Weich steel. A 60mm armored hangar deck sat below the flight deck. Belt armor ranged from 60 to 100 millimeters, thickest amidships over machinery and magazines. This was heavier protection than American carriers, but lighter than British armored carriers. The German design attempted to balance protection, speed, and aircraft capacity. The result was compromises across all 3 parameters. Aircraft capacity was specified as 42 aircraft. The initial plan called for 12 Fieseler Fi 167 biplane torpedo bombers, 20 Junkers, Ju-87, Stuka dive bombers, and 10 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. Later plans changed the mix to 30 Ju-87s and 12 Bf-109s, eliminating the Fi 167 entirely. All were navalized versions of land-based aircraft, modified with arresting hooks, folding wings where applicable, and strengthened landing gear. None were designed from inception as carrier aircraft. The modifications were compromises that reduced performance compared to land-based versions while failing to optimize for carrier operations. The Ju-87 had fixed landing gear, high drag, limited speed. The Bf-109 had narrow landing gear that made carrier landings difficult. The Fi 167 had good low-speed handling, but was obsolescent by 1939 standards. A proper carrier air wing required purpose-designed aircraft. Germany never developed them. The keel of Graf Zeppelin was laid down on December 28, 1936. The slipway had recently been occupied by the battleship Gneisenau, launched 8 days earlier. Construction proceeded through 1937 and 1938. On December 8, 1938, the ship was launched. The date was the 24th anniversary of the Battle of the Falkland Islands, where German commerce raiders had been destroyed by British battlecruisers. The symbolism was lost on no one. This carrier would avenge that defeat by giving Germany the naval air power to threaten British sea control. Raeder-Goring gave the launching speech. The ship was christened Graf Zeppelin by Helene von Zeppelin, daughter of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, the airship pioneer. Hitler attended. Raeder attended. The ceremony was propaganda, demonstrating German technological prowess and naval ambition. Construction was 85% complete. Projected commissioning, mid-1940. Then priorities changed. The German conquest of Norway, in April 1940, provided air bases along the Norwegian coast. Luftwaffe units could operate from these bases to threaten British shipping, support German naval forces, and conduct reconnaissance over vast areas of the North Sea and Norwegian Sea. The need for carrier-based aviation diminished, or so it appeared to planners who didn't understand carrier operations. More critically, the conquest of Norway required coastal defense guns and anti-aircraft batteries. The weapons designated for Graf Zeppelin could be diverted to Norway immediately. The fire control systems being installed on the carrier had already been sold to the Soviet Union as part of a technology exchange program. Installing replacement systems would take months. Completing the ship would require resources needed urgently elsewhere. On April 30th, 1940, Raeder met with Hitler and recommended that work on Graf Zeppelin be suspended. This was Raeder's decision, not Hitler's. The Norwegian campaign had demonstrated that land-based air power could support naval operations. The carrier seemed less essential. Construction ceased in June 1940 with the ship 90% complete. The crew was disbanded. Trägergruppe 186, the carrier air wing that had been forming at Kiel-Holtenau since September 1939, was dissolved. The pilots were reassigned to land-based units. Flugzeugträger B suffered worse. Construction had begun in 1938 at Germania Werft in Kiel. By September 1939, when war began, the hull was complete only to the armored deck. On September 19th, Raeder ordered construction halted. U-boat production took priority. On February 28, 1940, Raeder ordered the hull broken up and scrapped. The work was completed 4 months later. Germany's second carrier was destroyed before launching. 2 more carriers, C and D, had been planned under Plan Z. They were never started. For 2 years, Graf Zeppelin sat incomplete at the Deutsche Werke fitting out basin. Her propulsion machinery was not installed. Her armament was not mounted. Her flight deck was incomplete. The ship was a steel hull tied to a pier, slowly deteriorating from weather and neglect. Then reality intruded. In November 1940, British carrier aircraft attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto, crippling 3 battleships with torpedo bombers launched from HMS Illustrious. In May 1941, carrier aircraft from HMS Ark Royal damaged Bismarck's rudder, allowing British battleships to catch and sink her. In December 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft devastated the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. In March 1942, British carriers prevented Tirpitz from attacking Arctic convoys. In June 1942, American carriers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. The utility of aircraft carriers in modern naval warfare was no longer theoretical. Every major naval power except Germany operated carriers. Every major naval engagement involved carrier aviation. The Kriegsmarine had nothing. In April 1942, Raeder met with Hitler to discuss naval strategy. Raeder was desperate. The surface fleet was bottled up in Norwegian fjords, unable to operate without air cover. U-boat losses were increasing as Allied escort carriers provided air protection for convoys. The strategic situation was deteriorating. Raeder argued that Graf Zeppelin could be completed in approximately 1 year, with 6 months additional for sea trials and aircrew training. The ship existed. The investment had been made. Finishing her made sense. Hitler authorized resumption of work on May 13, 1942. Construction restarted, but the problems were worse than Raeder had acknowledged. The ship had been exposed to weather for 2 years. Systems had corroded. Equipment had been removed and used elsewhere. The aircraft designated for the carrier were obsolescent. The Ju-87 was vulnerable to modern fighters. The Bf-109 lacked range and endurance. New aircraft would need to be designed, tested, produced, Training pilots for carrier operations would take months, maybe years. Germany had no institutional experience with carrier operations. Everything had to be learned. And Goering still controlled the Luftwaffe, still controlled all aircraft production, still refused to allow the Kriegsmarine to operate its own air arm. The bureaucratic warfare that had delayed carrier development before the war continued during the war with even more damaging effect. Goering's opposition was multifaceted. He viewed carrier aircraft as belonging to the Luftwaffe, not the Kriegsmarine. He opposed diverting production capacity to naval aircraft when the Luftwaffe needed fighters, bombers, transports. He resented Raeder personally, viewing him as representing the old aristocratic officer class that Goering despised. And he was Hitler's designated successor. Giving him political power, Raeder couldn't match. The conflict manifested in dozens of bureaucratic battles. Who would control carrier aircraft once the ship was operational? What priority would carrier aircraft receive in production schedules? Which units would provide pilots? Who would develop tactics and doctrine? Every question became a fight. Every decision required Hitler's intervention. Progress was glacial. In November 1942, the situation deteriorated further. The Battle of the Barents Sea demonstrated that German surface forces could not operate effectively against determined Allied opposition. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and pocket battleship Lutzow, supported by 6 destroyers, attacked convoy JW-51B in the Arctic. 2 British light cruisers and 4 destroyers defended the convoy. The engagement was inconclusive, but the German force withdrew after sinking 1 destroyer and damaging another. The convoy reached the Soviet Union intact. Hitler was furious. He had expected the heavy ships to annihilate the convoy. Instead, they had achieved nothing. On January 6, 1943, Hitler ordered all major surface units decommissioned. The crews would be transferred to U-boats. The guns would be removed and installed as coastal batteries. The Kriegsmarine as a surface force would cease to exist. Raeder objected. Hitler was adamant. On January 30, 1943, Raeder resigned as commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine. His replacement was Admiral Karl Dönitz, the U-boat commander. Dönitz believed that U-boats were Germany's only effective naval weapon. He viewed battleships and cruisers as resource sinks that accomplished nothing. He viewed aircraft carriers as even worse, requiring not just ships but aircraft, pilots, support facilities, doctrine development, all-consuming resources that could build dozens of U-boats. On February 2, 1943, Dönitz ordered all work on Graf Zeppelin halted permanently. The project was dead. The ship was towed to Stettin and moored in the Parnitz River with a 40-man skeleton crew. She sat there for 2 years, a symbol of institutional dysfunction and strategic failure. In April 1945, as Soviet forces approached, the crew flooded the ship and detonated demolition charges to prevent capture. Graf Zeppelin settled into the mud, her back broken, her structure compromised beyond repair. After the war, the Soviets refloated the wreck. In March 1946, the hull was raised and inspected. Soviet naval architects examined the design, documented the construction, assessed the damage. In April 1947, the wreck was towed from Stettin loaded with containers, possibly looted factory equipment. The destination was unclear. Some sources claim she struck a mine off Finland and sank en route to Leningrad. Others claim she reached Leningrad and was broken up in 1948. Declassified Soviet records revealed the truth. On August 14 through 16, 1947, Graf Zeppelin was used as a target ship. Soviet naval forces conducted live fire exercises, testing weapons and tactics. Torpedoes were fired, bombs were dropped. Artillery engaged from multiple ranges. The wreck absorbed tremendous punishment before finally sinking. The exact location remained unknown until July 12, 2006, when Polish research vessel RV Sankt Barbara discovered the wreck lying in approximately 80 meters of water in the Baltic Sea, 55 kilometers north of Władysławowo. The failure of Graf Zeppelin represents more than one ship unfinished. It represents the systemic dysfunction that undermined German military effectiveness throughout the war. The Goering-Raeder rivalry was not unique. Similar conflicts existed between the Army and the SS, between different branches of the Luftwaffe, between competing industrial interests, between regional party officials and national ministries. Nazi Germany operated in a state of perpetual bureaucratic warfare where institutional interest took precedence over strategic objectives. In this environment, completing Graf Zeppelin was impossible. The project required sustained cooperation between the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe. It required consistent resource allocation across years. It required clear doctrine about how the ship would operate and what missions it would perform. None of these conditions existed. Every decision became a political battle. Every resource allocation was contested. Every technical requirement was subject to interference from officials who understood politics but not naval warfare. The technical challenges were surmountable. German engineering was excellent. The shipyard could build the hull. The machinery could be installed. The armament could be mounted. The aircraft could be modified or designed from scratch. These were engineering problems with engineering solutions. But engineering solutions require time, resources, and political support. In Nazi Germany, political support was contingent on the personal relationships between leaders, the alignment of institutional interests, and the whims of Hitler's decision-making. Graf Zeppelin had none of these factors working in her favor. What if the ship had been completed? What if the institutional barriers had been overcome and Graf Zeppelin had commissioned in 1940 or 1941? The strategic impact would have been modest. One carrier could not change the naval balance. The Royal Navy operated dozens of carriers by 1941. The United States was building Essex-class carriers at a rate faster than Germany could produce the aircraft to equip Graf Zeppelin. Japan had 6 fleet carriers operational and more building. Germany entering carrier warfare in 1941 would be competing against opponents with 2 decades of operational experience, established doctrine, trained pilots, and industrial capacity Germany couldn't match. But the ship would have complicated British operations. Graf Zeppelin, accompanying Bismarck on her breakout sortie in May 1941, would have provided air cover that might have prevented the Swordfish torpedo attack that crippled Bismarck's steering. The battleship might have escaped, or might have been sunk by additional British forces committed to hunting a carrier task force rather than a lone battleship. The what-ifs multiply without clear answers. More realistically, Graf Zeppelin would have posed problems in the Norwegian Sea, providing air cover for surface raiders attacking Arctic convoys. The threat would have forced the Royal Navy to commit additional carriers to northern waters, diverting them from Mediterranean and Atlantic operations. This was the strategic concept behind Raeder's Plan Z. Force Britain to disperse naval strength to counter multiple threats, creating opportunities for German surface forces to achieve local superiority and attack vulnerable convoys. But this assumed Germany could protect the carrier from British attack. British carriers operated with destroyer and cruiser escorts, supported by battleships when necessary. Graf Zeppelin would require similar protection. The Kriegsmarine had limited destroyers and cruisers. Escort assets were insufficient for major operations. Without adequate escort, the carrier would be vulnerable to submarine attack, surface action, or concentrated airstrikes. Losing the only German carrier would be a propaganda disaster worse than letting her sit unfinished. The aircrew training problem would have been severe. Germany had no carrier-qualified pilots in 1939. Developing proficiency in carrier operations required years. American and Japanese carrier pilots trained for 2 years before deploying. British pilots trained for 18 months minimum. German pilots would need similar training timeframes. But where would they train? Graf Zeppelin was the only platform. Mock-up facilities ashore could simulate landing practice, but not the full operational environment. First deployment would occur with partially trained crews learning on the job. Early operations would be high risk with limited effectiveness. The aircraft themselves were inadequate. The Ju-87 was effective against land targets, but vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Against British carriers with Sea Hurricane or Martlet fighters, Stukas would suffer heavy losses. The Bf-109 had insufficient range for effective combat air patrol. Carriers needed long range, long-endurance fighters capable of remaining airborne for hours while defending the fleet. The Bf-109 could manage 90 minutes on station in ideal conditions. This was insufficient. Germany would have needed to develop carrier-specific aircraft. Torpedo bombers with range and payload capacity, dive bombers with speed and defensive armament, fighters with endurance and visibility. The United States developed the TBF Avenger, SPD Dauntless, and F-6F Hellcat specifically for carrier operations. Japan developed the B-5N Kate, D-3 Rival, and A-6M0. Britain developed the Swordfish, Albacore, and Sea Hurricane. Germany developed nothing equivalent. Converting land-based aircraft was a stopgap that produced inferior results. The doctrinal challenges would have been equally severe. How should a carrier operate? Independent missions against convoys. In company with battleships providing mutual support. Close to shore with land-based air support, or far from shore relying on self-defense. American, British, and Japanese navies had spent years answering these questions through exercises, war games, and operational experience. Germany would start from zero knowledge. The institutional structure would have remained dysfunctional. Even with Graf Zeppelin operational, the Luftwaffe would control the aircraft. Carrier operations would require coordination between Kriegsmarine ship commanders and Luftwaffe air wing commanders. American and Japanese carriers solved this by putting everyone under naval command with clear chains of authority. German carriers would have divided command, with the ship under Raeder and the aircraft under Goring. This was a recipe for disaster in combat where decisions need to be made in seconds, not argued through bureaucratic channels. Some historians argue Graf Zeppelin represents wasted resources. The steel, labor, and money consumed by carrier construction could have built dozens of U-boats. Dönitz made this argument explicitly when he canceled the project in 1943. U-boats were Germany's most effective naval weapon, sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping. Every resource devoted to carriers was a resource not devoted to submarine construction. This argument has merit, but ignores the broader strategic picture. Germany needed to contest British naval superiority across multiple domains. U-boats alone could not achieve this. The British developed effective anti-submarine tactics, deployed escort carriers, cracked German codes, and achieved mastery over the submarine threat by 1943. Surface raiders provided an alternative threat that forced British dispersal of resources. Carriers would have complicated British planning and forced allocation of additional forces to counter the carrier threat. But the German failure was not building too few carriers. The failure was building zero carriers. One partially complete ship that never sailed represents total failure. This failure was not technical. Germany had the engineering capability. The failure was institutional, the result of internal rivalries that made cooperation impossible and ensured that Germany would never develop effective naval air power. The legacy of Graf Zeppelin is absence. The ship that should have provided Germany with naval air power didn't. The aircraft that should have protected German surface forces weren't there. The pilots who should have attacked Allied convoys were never trained. The tactical innovations that should have emerged from carrier operations never happened. Germany fought the naval war with one arm tied behind its back, unable to project air power beyond land-based aircraft range, unable to defend surface forces from air attack, unable to threaten Allied carrier task forces. This was the cost of the Goring-Raeder rivalry. Not one ship unfinished, an entire capability absent. The Kriegsmarine fought World War II without carrier aviation because two men couldn't agree on who would control the aircraft. Thousands of sailors died on ships that lacked air cover. Convoys were attacked by British carrier aircraft without German fighters to contest air superiority. Operations were planned and cancelled because air support wasn't available. The strategic impact was incalculable but real. Graf Zeppelin sits on the Baltic seabed, broken by Soviet weapons testing. A monument to bureaucratic dysfunction and institutional failure. The wreck is a time capsule, preserving the design compromises and technical solutions that German engineers developed for problems they never solved operationally. Divers who have explored the wreck report seeing the unfinished spaces, the missing equipment, the structural damage from scuttling and Soviet testing. The ship is disintegrating slowly, corroded by seawater, colonized by marine organisms, fading into history. No memorial marks her location. No ceremony commemorates her launching. She is a footnote in histories that focus on ships that fought rather than ships that never commissioned. But her absence shaped the war. Every British convoy that passed without German carrier attack. Every Arctic convoy that reached Soviet ports protected by British carriers facing no German opposition. Every operation the Kriegsmarine couldn't attempt because air cover wasn't available. These were consequences of Graf Zeppelin's failure. The what-ifs remain unanswerable. What if Goring had cooperated with Raeder? What if Hitler had forced resolution of the carrier aircraft control dispute? What if Graf Zeppelin had commissioned in 1940 with trained crews and effective aircraft? These questions multiply without conclusion because the fundamental factors that prevented completion, the institutional rivalries and political dysfunction, were inherent to Nazi Germany's structure. Fixing the carrier problem would have required fixing the regime's systemic problems. That was impossible. So Graf Zeppelin remains unfinished. 95% complete but 0% effective. 8 years of construction producing nothing but a wreck on the seabed. 56 million Reichsmarks consumed with no return. And the lesson is clear. Weapon systems require more than engineering competence. They require institutional structures that enable cooperation, political leadership that resolves conflicts, strategic vision that aligns resources with objectives. Germany had excellent engineering. It lacked everything else necessary to build a carrier force. The failure is complete. The ship is gone. The opportunity is lost. And the historical record preserves one conclusion. Nazi Germany attempted to build an aircraft carrier and failed absolutely. Not because the technical challenges were insurmountable, but because the political and institutional barriers were